They said the Emperor of Rome had taken a new wife. They did not say she used to be a boy. Picture the marble avenues of Rome in the summer of 67 AD. The sun burns gold across the forum's white columns, glinting off bronze armor and the polished marble underfoot. Merchants call out in coarse Latin, the smell of bread ovens mixing with the musk of sweating crowds. It is the living pulse of the empire, noisy, impatient, always watching. And then the crowd stills. The emperor himself, Nero Claudius Caesar, steps into view. At his side glides a young woman draped in silks so fine they ripple like water at every step. Her hair is arranged in intricate coils pinned with gemstones, her skin luminous under the Roman sun. She is the kind of beauty that should inspire poetry. But no one is smiling. Heads turn, lips tighten, and the whispers begin to snake through the crowd like smoke. That's not a woman, that's Sporus. They know the story at least, the parts the palace couldn't hide, the surgeries, the dresses, the ceremony. They know that whatever this is, it was born from grief twisted into obsession. They know that the emperor who commands armies and can order any death with a word has used his power to take something far more intimate from Sporus. His body, his identity, his name. In the charged silence of the forum, every gaze holds a question no one dares speak aloud. Is this devotion or desecration? And no answer, however whispered, can make what they are seeing feel less wrong. To understand how Rome reached this moment, how a boy was reshaped into the shadow of a dead empress, you must go back to the beginning. Back to when Nero was still a youth with a face full of promise, when the empire looked to him not with fear, but with hope. Because the story of Sporus is not just about cruelty, it is about how unchecked power can rot a man from the inside. Until love is only another word for possession, and the living are sculpted to replace the dead. When Nero ascended the throne in 54 AD, he was just 16 years old, barely a man by Roman standards, yet suddenly ruler of an empire stretching from the cold rains of Britannia to the burning sands of Egypt. The Senate, still wary from the heavy-handed reigns of his predecessors, dared to hope that youth might mean renewal. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed they were right. In the first years, Nero's policies reflected the touch of a ruler, eager to please. Taxes were reduced, the cost of grain was lowered, and grand spectacles were funded out of the imperial treasury to win the love of the masses. Gladiatorial games multiplied, public banquets fed thousands, and music and theatre arts, often dismissed as frivolous by the Roman elite, were given pride of place in civic life. Nero didn't just sponsor performances, he performed himself, taking the stage in elaborate costumes, playing the lyre, reciting poetry. To the common people, this was charming, even revolutionary. Here was a Caesar who would descend from the marble dais to stand among them, to share in the joys of performance, to be seen as human. But Rome's elite watched with unease. To them, emperors were meant to command armies, not applause. Military discipline was the backbone of Roman power, and the sight of the emperor singing on stage unsettled generals and senators alike. Yet in those early years, their disapproval was tempered by stability. The provinces were quiet, the treasury healthy, the grain ships from Egypt arriving on time. For a little while, the city could pretend it had found a ruler, both adored by the people and competent enough to keep the machinery of empire running. Still, the palace has a way of warping its occupants. Nero's education in statecraft had been shaped less by civic duty than by survival in a court where intrigue was currency. He had learned early to mask his thoughts, to listen for the subtext in every word, to sense which smiles hid daggers. And now, as emperor, he was surrounded by a wall of flattery so thick that truth could rarely pierce it. Every opinion he voiced was echoed back in agreement. Every whim was treated as law. It is a dangerous thing to live without contradiction. In such a life, doubt becomes a foreign language, and the self-image grows unchecked, like ivy wrapping around a ruin until it consumes the stone beneath. For Nero, that self-image was increasingly tied to art, beauty, and spectacle. He wanted to be remembered not just as a ruler, but as a living work of art, an ideal form elevated above ordinary men. Yet behind this golden surface, the seeds of paranoia were already taking root. He knew power in Rome was never absolute, not really. Every emperor was surrounded by those who watched for weakness. The Senate could not openly defy him, but they could conspire. The Praetorian Guard swore loyalty, but only as long as their loyalty was rewarded. Even family could turn, especially family. In those early years, the balance still held. But history shows how fragile it was. All it would take was the arrival of one person, one dazzling, ambitious, and dangerous enough to capture his entire heart, to begin unraveling that balance. That person would not just win his affection, she would become the lens through which Nero saw the world. And when she was gone, he would remake the world itself to bring her back. Her name was Poppa Sabina. Poppa Sabina entered Nero's life like a torch thrown into dry timber, sudden, dazzling, and impossible to ignore. Born into a wealthy family, she had grown up in an environment where refinement and ambition were as essential as air. Her beauty was legendary even before she reached the imperial court. Ancient writers describe skin so pale it caught the light like marble, hair that shone like polished gold, and eyes that seemed to calculate as much as they charmed. But it wasn't beauty alone that made Poppaea dangerous. She was intelligent sharply, strategically so. She understood that in Rome, survival at the top was an art form, and she mastered it early. She learned when to flatter, when to withhold, when to offer advice, and when to let a man believe the idea was his own. In an empire where most women of rank were expected to orbit quietly around their husband's ambitions, Poppa moved like a planet with its own gravity. When Nero first saw her, he was already bound in a cold political marriage to Octavia, daughter of the former emperor Claudius. Octavia was dutiful and dignified, the perfect imperial wife in the Senate's eyes, but to Nero, she was lifeless marble. Poppaea was fire. Where Octavia avoided attention, Poppaea thrived in it. Where Octavia deferred, Poppa challenged. She carried herself as though the gaze of an entire court was her natural right. At first, their connection followed a familiar Roman pattern, an affair whispered about in the baths and back rooms, tolerated so long as it didn't threaten political stability. But Nero's attraction deepened into something far more dangerous. He wasn't simply infatuated, he was consumed. His thoughts, his moods, his public appearances began to revolve around her presence. Ancient chroniclers describe how his temper would flare into sudden, irrational fury if another man so much as lingered on her face too long at a banquet. Poppa was no passive figure in this dance. She recognized the emperor's fixation for what it was, a weapon she could wield. She began using her influence to advance her family's fortunes, ensuring her allies held key positions and her enemies were quietly removed from favor. Yet she also understood the peril in standing too close to an emperor's fire. His passion could illuminate, but it could also burn. By the time Nero divorced Octavia, a shocking act that risked alienating old political allies, his intentions toward Poppaea were no longer rumor. Their wedding was a spectacle even by imperial standards. Processions through the city streets, feasts that lasted for days, musicians playing from balconies draped in silk. It was not merely a marriage, it was a declaration that Poppaea now stood at the very center of the Roman world. But in Rome, to be at the center is also to be in the crosshairs. Every noblewoman in the city would have known the precariousness of her position. As much as Poppaea had gained, her life was now tethered entirely to the whims of one man, a man whose self-image was growing ever more fragile. And in the years to come, that fragility would prove fatal. From the moment she became Empress, Poppa's life was wrapped in layers of luxury so opulent, they began to feel like chains. Nero's devotion manifested not in quiet tenderness, but in acts of possession, as though she were a jewel to be guarded, polished, and displayed. He stationed guards around her constantly, not merely to protect her from danger, but to monitor her every word, every glance, every interaction. The imperial treasury groaned under the weight of his gifts. From the east came silks dyed in the rarest shades of Tyrian purple. From the deserts of Arabia, amphorae of perfume distilled from flowers worth more than gold. From India, sapphires the size of a thumbnail. Rome was already the beating heart of a vast trade network, but Nero bent that network entirely toward a single goal, surrounding Poppaea with beauty that matched, in his mind, her own. Yet there was something unsettling beneath the extravagance. Ancient accounts tell us Nero began filling private chambers with her likeness-painted portraits, marble busts, even gilded miniatures that could be carried in his hand. He wanted her image within reach at all times, so that even when she was not physically present, she could be looked at, admired, and possessed. Isolation followed. Friends and family who had once been regular companions were gradually pushed aside, replaced by attendants whose loyalty was not to Poppaea but to Nero himself. Conversations were monitored. Letters disappeared before they could leave the palace. Every aspect of her world was curated by the emperor, until the only environment she inhabited was one shaped entirely by his will. For Poppaea, the danger was not hidden. She was astute enough to know that such obsession was a double-edged sword, immense power in her hands when she could direct it, mortal peril if she ever provoked it. Still, she did not play the role of silent ornament. She challenged Nero when it suited her, advised him on political maneuvering, and openly criticized choices she thought unwise. She could laugh at his poetry if it fell flat, or question the wisdom of his artistic pursuits when the empire demanded his attention elsewhere. It was precisely this independence, this refusal to be fully subsumed into his image of her, that both fascinated and infuriated him. To a man who expected the world to bend to his will, Poppaea's moments of defiance were like cracks in a flawless statue, hairline fractures that could not be ignored. What neither could have known was how quickly one of those fractures would split wide open. All it would take was one argument ordinary in its beginnings, catastrophic in its end, to transform their gilded partnership into a story that Rome would whisper about for centuries. The details of that day in 65 AD drive IFT through history in fragments, different in each telling, but all ending the same way. Some say the quarrel began over Nero's lateness. He had lingered too long at the chariot races, ignoring his pregnant wife waiting at the palace. Others claim it was about his theatrical ambitions, the way he poured more energy into perfecting his singing voice than into ruling an empire. Whatever the spark, the fire caught quickly. Poppaea was not a woman who softened her words to spare a man's pride, and on that day she aimed them like arrows. She accused him, according to Tacitus, of caring more for his public image than for his duties as a husband or father. She reminded him perhaps with a pointed glance toward her rounded belly that there was more at stake than applause and silk costumes. Her words struck home, but not in the way she might have hoped. Nero, already tense from weeks of political strain and his own unsteady moods, reacted with volcanic force. Ancient sources disagree on whether it was a single violent blow, a sudden kick to her abdomen, or a flurry of strikes in blind rage. But they agree on this. She collapsed, bleeding internally, the life inside her snuffed out, along with her own. The room must have gone silent, except for her breathing shallow, ragged, and Nero's own, sharp with the realization of what he had done. Here was the man who could order the deaths of generals without hesitation, who commanded 30 legions across 3 continents, kneeling beside the one person he could not afford to lose. He begged her to live, ordered physicians to the palace with promises of untold riches if they saved her, and threats of unspeakable pain if they failed. But no wealth, no imperial decree, could undo the damage. Within hours, the Empress of Rome, his obsession, his muse, the woman he had reshaped his entire world around, was gone, taking with her the unborn child who might have been his heir. That was the moment, historians say, when something in Nero's mind cracked beyond repair. grief did not soften him, it warped him, and in the months that followed, his mourning would take a form so strange, so theatrical, that those in the imperial court would be forced to participate in a dangerous fiction that Papa had not truly left at all. In Rome, the dead were meant to pass quickly into memory. Cremation was the honoured custom. The body burned on a pyre, the ashes sealed in an urn, the living left to honour the spirit through ceremony and remembrance. But Nero refused. He would not see Papa reduced to ash. Instead, he ordered her body embalmed, preserved with the same painstaking care reserved for royalty in the ancient kingdoms of the East. She was placed in a tomb more elaborate than those of any emperor before her, a monument of marble and gold, designed not for mourning, but for worship. Nero declared her divine, establishing a state cult in her honor. Statues rose in temples, offerings were made in her name. To speak of her as anything less than a goddess was dangerous. And yet, in the privacy of the palace, Nero's grief was something far stranger. He was often seen speaking to her body as though she could answer, arranging banquets where her favorite place was left empty, but her cup still poured. Servants were instructed to refer to her in the present tense, to behave as if she might enter the room at any moment. This was not just a ruler mourning his wife. It was a ruler bending reality to match the world he wanted. In the emperor's mind, the lines between the living and the dead blurred until they no longer mattered. If Rome's laws and customs could be rewritten at his whim, why not death itself? The court adapted, as it always did. Ministers, senators, and attendants learned to smile in the face of this madness, to nod when Nero recounted conversations he had with Poppaea, to participate in the fragile illusion that she had never truly left. To break the illusion, even by accident, was to risk exile or worse. It was in this fevered atmosphere that Nero first saw the boy. He was a freedman of the imperial household, no more than 14 or 15, moving quietly through the palace with a bundle of scrolls under one arm. There was nothing remarkable about his duties, yet there was something remarkable about his face. The resemblance was uncanny. The same delicate bone structure, the same wide, searching eyes. In that instant, Nero's grief-hazed mind must have flickered with recognition not of the boy, but of the woman he had lost. His name was Sporus, and from that moment, his life was no longer his own. Sporus had been born into slavery, his earliest memories tied to the echoing halls and shaded courtyards of the imperial household. Like many palace-born slaves, he was trained from childhood for service reading and writing for administrative work, etiquette for attending to high-ranking officials, and a quiet, disciplined manner that made him invisible when needed. By the time he was freed as a young adolescent, a common practice for promising servants in the emperor's favor, he occupied a strange place in Roman society, no longer property, but far from independent. A freedman in the imperial household could enjoy comforts beyond the reach of most freeborn Romans of the lower classes, fine clothing, regular meals, even a modest income. But such privilege came with chains made of loyalty and fear. The emperor's will was the air they breathed. Favor could lift a man to heights of influence. The loss of it could destroy him overnight. Sporus might have lived out his days in quiet service, keeping the machinery of palace life running in the background, had it not been for the accident of his face. Ancient historians, not given to understatement, tell us that his resemblance to the late Empress Poppaea was marvelous and unnerving. It wasn't just the features, the soft jawline, the high cheekbones, but something about the way he carried himself, the tilt of his head when he listened, that seemed to echo her. In Roman thought, resemblance was not merely cosmetic. The ancients often believed physical likeness reflected deeper connections, spiritual, even mystical. And for Nero, steeped in grief and delusion, the sight of Sporus must have felt like an omen, or worse, an opportunity. Here, perhaps, was a way to reverse the irreversible, to call Poppaea back from the void, not through prayer or sacrifice, but through the moulding of flesh and will. But there was an obstacle. Sporus was male. For most men, that would have ended the thought before it began. For Nero, who believed himself a god and had already defied Roman custom in his morning rituals, it was barely a complication. In the same way a sculptor might chip away marble to reveal the statue hidden within, he decided Sporus could be corrected. The boy himself would have had no say in the matter. In the imperial court, even senators feared to contradict the emperor's whims. For a teenage freedman whose entire life depended on the emperor's favor, resistance was not an option, it was unthinkable. And so, without warning, Sporus was drawn into the private chambers of Nero's grief-driven obsession, where the first step toward transformation would be ordered, prepared, and made irreversible. The command came quietly, without ceremony, as if Nero were merely instructing a servant to fetch wine, yet its weight was absolute. Sporus was to be altered permanently, so that he might take the place of the Empress. The boy was not being asked. In Rome, an imperial order was not a request. It was a fact that would happen, no matter the cost. The emperor summoned the finest physicians in the city, men accustomed to tending senators and generals, not to performing what he now demanded. Roman medicine, in the 1st century AD, was a strange mix of skill and superstition. They could set broken bones, stitch wounds, and perform simple surgeries, but procedures were crude and dangerous. Infection claimed more lives than the knife itself, and pain relief was primitive strong wine, opium resin, or mandrake root. What Nero ordered was not just a procedure, it was mutilation. Sporus would be castrated to erase any trace of manhood, the emperor's solution to the problem of gender. This was not unprecedented in Rome. Eunuchs existed in the eastern provinces, but in the capital, the act carried deep stigma. To be made incapable of fathering children was to be cut off from the core of Roman masculinity, stripped of the right to carry on a family name. For Sporus, the physical danger was matched only by the terror of the unknown. In the guarded rooms where the procedure took place, he would have been surrounded by men with steady hands and cold eyes, their instruments of bronze glinting in the lamplight, heated blades to cut, cloth strips to bind, basins ready to catch, water-tinged pink. There would be no gentle reassurance, only commands barked by attendants holding him still, because hesitation could be fatal if the patient moved. We do not know how long the procedure lasted, only that he survived it. Survival was not guaranteed. Many who underwent such operations died within days from infection or blood loss. Sporus endured, but when the pain began to fade, a far crueler reality took its place. The boy he had been was gone. In Nero's eyes, however, this was only the beginning. Altering Sporus's body was a first step toward crafting an illusion so complete that the emperor could pretend Popper had returned, and in the weeks that followed, the palace transformed into a kind of theatre, its tailors, jewelers, and tutors all enlisted in the task of turning a freedman into an empress. The transformation began in silence, behind the closed bronze doors of Nero's private quarters. Sporus was given a new name, Sabina, after the dead empress herself. From that moment forward, his old name was not to be spoken aloud in the palace. In Rome, names carried identity, lineage, honor. By replacing it, Nero severed Sporus from his past as cleanly as the physician's knives had severed his body. The imperial seamstresses worked first, measuring his frame and stitching gowns designed to hide the masculine lines that remained. These were no ordinary garments. They were masterpieces of silk and dyed linen, woven with golden threads and cut to flatter the new silhouette the surgery had forced upon him. Some of these dresses had belonged to Popper herself, their hems worn by her steps, their fabric carrying the faint trace of perfume she once favored. Now they were altered to fit Sporus, the living replacement. Then came the jewelry. Master goldsmiths were instructed to fashion pieces that echoed the late Empress's favorites. Necklaces studded with pearls from the Red Sea, bracelets of twisted gold, rings set with deep green emeralds. Many incorporated stones that had once adorned Poppaea directly, each ornament a physical chain tying Sporus more tightly to the role he had been given. The physical changes were only part of the work. Nero's attendants brought in experts to shape behavior, voice, and bearing. Speech tutors coached him to raise his pitch, to soften his consonants, to adopt the lilting cadences of Roman high-born women. Movement instructors drilled him on how to walk with short, measured steps, how to incline the head in polite acknowledgement, how to sit so that the folds of a gown draped gracefully. Even his gestures, how to lift a cup, how to extend a hand, were rehearsed until they seemed natural. The hairdressers were relentless. Each morning, his hair was curled, pinned, and woven into intricate knots fashionable among aristocratic women. Heated bronze rods and scented oils left the air thick with the smell of scorched hair and crushed myrtle leaves. The process could take hours, and Sporus was expected to endure it without complaint. But the most insidious training was psychological. Every mirror reflected not the boy he had been, but the Empress he was expected to become. Every compliment from Nero was measured against how closely he resembled Poppaea in that moment. Every mistake a step too wide, a voice that slipped into a lower register, was a reminder that his survival depended on perfect performance. In the grand halls of the palace, the transformation was nearly complete. To those who did not know the truth, Sabina might have appeared to be just another beautiful consort of the emperor. But those who did know, and there were many, could not look at Sporus without a flicker of unease. They understood they were not seeing a woman, nor even a man. They were seeing grief weaponized into control, identity rewritten by decree, and a living body turned into a monument to the dead. It would all culminate in an event as public as it was grotesque. The wedding of Nero and Sporus. Spring of 67 AD arrived in Rome, dressed in blossoms and banners. Festivals filled the calendar days of religious observance, chariot races, theatrical performances. It was the perfect backdrop for an event Nero intended to be remembered for generations. His marriage to Sabina. The invitations, if they could be called that, were more like summons. Senators, generals, and foreign envoys understood there was no refusing the emperor's command to attend. The chosen venue was one of the largest palace halls, transformed into a vision of imperial splendor. Floors were strewn with petals imported from Alexandria, their scent mingling with the heavy perfume that clung to the air. Thousands of oil lamps cast a warm glow over marble columns wrapped in silk. Musicians played traditional Roman wedding songs, their rhythms familiar yet surreal in this context. Servants circulated with trays of rare delicacies, figs soaked in honeyed wine, roasted peacocks, oysters from distant Britannia, while officials and courtiers whispered behind carefully arranged smiles. They knew this was no ordinary wedding. The bride was a teenage boy, surgically altered, dressed in the late Empress's gowns and jewels, and yet every gesture, every ritual, would be carried out as if the match were beyond question. Nero spared nothing in making the ceremony mirror that of a true imperial union. There was the clasping of right hands, symbolizing shared fate. There was the sharing of farium sacred spelt bread, broken and eaten together before witnesses. Legal documents were signed, giving the marriage the weight of Roman law. Gifts were presented: golden cups, carved ivory, gemstones of impossible size, all given with the same congratulations offered to any newlyweds, though here they were offered with eyes lowered and voices carefully steady. Those who watched closely could see the dual performance unfolding. Nero, smiling with the confidence of a man who believed he had cheated death itself, looked at Sporus as though seeing Poppaea restored. Sporus, for his part, met every glance, every word, with the grace and precision drilled into him over months. He stood as the Empress would have stood, spoke as she would have spoken, even allowed his eyes to soften in the way she had been known to do when listening to her husband. To the unknowing outsider, it might have seemed a genuine union. To those in the know, it was something else entirely. A theatre of grief and control, a spectacle where the emperor's will reshaped reality in full view of Rome, but no one dared call it grotesque. In the presence of absolute power, even horror had to be dressed in applause. And from that day forward, Sporus was not merely Sabina in name and dress. He was the Empress of Rome, at least in every way Nero demanded him to be. From the moment the wedding rites ended, Sporus's existence became a perpetual stage performance, one from which there was no curtain call. He was given his own household staff, quarters within the palace complex, and a stipend from the imperial treasury befitting an empress. He travelled in a litter draped with embroidered cloth, accompanied by attendants who announced his arrival in the same formal tones once reserved for Popper. In public, the role was unrelenting. At state dinners, Sporus sat beside Nero, accepting the respectful bows of senators and foreign envoys. At public games, he was displayed in the emperor's box, his gown shimmering in the sun, his jewelry catching every flash of light. Courtiers addressed him as Augusta, offering toasts to his health, as though the fiction were absolute truth. But behind the closed doors of the palace, the role became even more surreal. Nero did not treat Sporus merely as a replacement, he treated him as if he were truly Poppaea returned. He reminisced about moments from their shared past memories that were never Sporus's to begin with, and expected him to respond as if they were. He would recall conversations they had once had, expecting the same answers. He would describe places they had visited together, waiting for Sporus to agree and add details. It was not enough to look like her. Sporus had to think like her, speak like her, be her in ways that could withstand the emperor's constant scrutiny. Any hesitation was dangerous. To survive, Sporus developed an uncanny ability to anticipate Nero's moods, to adjust his tone or expression in an instant, to fill in the blanks of invented memories so seamlessly that even Nero seemed to believe them. But survival came at a cost. The palace rooms assigned to him were decorated with Popper A's portraits and personal effects gowns she had worn, combs she had used, perfumes she had favoured. Every object was a reminder that the space was not his. It belonged to someone else, someone who no longer lived, someone he was required to become. Isolation deepened the strain. Few dared speak to him outside of the role, and fewer still would risk showing sympathy. To acknowledge the truth that Sporus was still a young man trapped in a masquerade would be to defy the emperor's will. And so, the days blurred into one another. Endless rehearsals of someone else's life, where even the most private moments were performances. For more than 2 years, this was Sporus's reality. But the next act would take him far beyond Rome, to a land where Nero's vanity and delusions would be displayed not just before his own people, but before an entirely different world. In 66 AD, Nero announced what he called a grand artistic pilgrimage, a tour of Greece, the cradle of theatre, poetry, and music. Officially, it was to honor the ancient Hellenic traditions. In truth, it was to prove to the world and to himself that he was not merely the ruler of Rome, but its greatest living artist. The journey was planned with the precision of a military campaign. Every major Greek city was to host festivals in Nero's honor, with competitions hastily arranged so he could compete in music, acting, and chariot racing. Of course, his victories were assured before he even set foot on the stage or in the arena. Judges, fearing imperial wrath, awarded him wreaths of laurel in contests that had been sacred to the Greeks for centuries. Sporus travelled at his side, presented to foreign dignitaries and local aristocrats as Sabina, Augusta Empress of Rome. For many Greeks, the fiction must have been jarring. They were no strangers to the theatre of politics, but this was something else entirely. A teenage boy, dressed in the height of Roman feminine fashion, moving through banquets and processions with the trained grace of a high-born woman. Whispers followed them as surely as they had in the forum, but here too, no one dared to confront the truth. At public appearances, Sporus played his role flawlessly, draped in gowns of dyed silk and wearing jewels that caught the light like stars. He poured libations at temple ceremonies, smiled beside Nero in chariot parades, and nodded graciously at the effusive greetings of city elders. Every gesture was measured, every word chosen to preserve the illusion. Behind the scenes, the tour was a travelling circus of excess. Entire streets were decorated for Nero's arrival. Temples were stripped of their treasures to be given as gifts to the emperor. Greek actors and musicians were compelled to perform for him in private, then sent away with coins and polite applause, knowing they had witnessed something grotesque in the emperor's self-worship. And always, there was the strange pairing at the centre of it all. Nero and Sporus, the emperor and his living ghost of a wife. For Nero, the fiction seemed complete. For Sporus, it was a prison without walls, the role of Empress following him from city to city, with no chance to step off the stage. But the Greek tour would be Nero's last great performance. Even as he basked in applause that echoed across marble theatres, trouble was gathering back in Rome, trouble that would soon sweep the emperor from his throne and Sporus from his gilded captivity into something far more dangerous. While Nero paraded through Greece in wreaths and silk, Rome's patience was fraying. The empire was vast, but its armies were restless, and its governors weary of an emperor more concerned with applause than administration. Grain shortages, heavy taxation to fund spectacles, and neglect of military matters gnawed at his support. The first cracks appeared far from the capital. Gaius Julius Vindex, governor of Gaul, raised the banner of revolt, denouncing Nero's misrule. Others followed, calculating that the emperor's grip on power had weakened. In Rome itself, the Praetorian Guard, the elite force sworn to protect the emperor, began to waver. Loyalty in the Guard was purchased, not earned, and when promises of higher pay came from the rebels, their allegiance shifted. By the time Nero returned from Greece in 68 AD, the political landscape had transformed. The Senate, sensing the change in wind, declared him a public enemy, an act that stripped him of his imperial protections and marked him for death. Once the most powerful man in the world, Nero now found himself with only a handful of loyal attendants. Among them was Sporus. They fled the city under cover of night, moving toward a villa outside Rome where they might regroup. But in truth, there was nowhere to run. Rebel forces closed in. Within the villa's walls, Nero swung between panic and delusion, one moment speaking of escape to the Parthian Empire, the next practicing the noble gestures he imagined he might make in a staged public suicide. Sporus, caught in the undertow of the emperor's collapse, could do nothing but follow. Whatever feelings he might have had, fear, resentment, pity, were hidden beneath the practiced mask of Sabina. The role had kept him alive for 2 years. Perhaps it could see him through the end. But there would be no rescue, no restoration. As the sounds of soldiers drew nearer, Nero realized the choice before him: to be paraded through the streets of Rome in chains, or to die by his own hand. "What an artist dies in me," he is said to have whispered, before pressing a blade to his throat with the help of a loyal servant. When it was over, the empire moved quickly to erase the man it had once worshipped. Statues were pulled down, his name struck from inscriptions. But for Sporus, Nero's death did not bring freedom. If anything, it made him more vulnerable than ever. He was no longer the emperor's living monument, he was a prize, a curiosity, a political symbol to be claimed by whoever seized power next. And in the bloody chaos of the year of the 4 emperors, there was no shortage of men eager to claim him. The year 69 AD would be remembered as Annus Horribilis, the year of the 4 emperors. In the power vacuum left by Nero's death, the empire became a battlefield of ambition. In that chaos, Sporus became less a person than a trophy, passed from victor to victor like captured treasure. First, he fell into the hands of Otho, a former ally and rival of Nero, who had briefly been Poppa's husband before she married the emperor. To Otho, possessing Sporus was more than a political statement, it was a personal echo of the woman they had both claimed. He treated Sporus much as Nero had, keeping him in women's clothing, addressing him as Sabina, parading him at social events. It was as if, for Otho, the boy's resemblance to Poppaea was a talisman, proof of continuity with the glamour of Nero's court. But Otho's reign lasted only 3 months before he was overthrown by Vitellius, a gruff soldier emperor whose appetites were more for spectacle than subtlety. If Nero had wrapped his cruelty in the trappings of love, Vitellius stripped away any illusion. He saw Sporus not as a living memorial, but as entertainment. According to historians, Vitellius devised a public humiliation so obscene it made even hardened Romans uneasy. He intended to force Sporus into the arena during the Floralia, a festival known for its bawdy and often cruel performances. The plan was to reenact the myth of Proserpina's abduction, with Sporus cast as the maiden goddess and a wild beast as Pluto. The scene would end with a staged violation of Sporus before a jeering crowd of thousands. This was more than degradation, it was annihilation in the most public form imaginable. Sporus had been forced to live as someone else's wife, but at least in the palace, his humiliation had been contained behind walls. Now, Vitellius meant to strip away even that privacy, to destroy the last shred of dignity he possessed. Faced with this final indignity, Sporus made the only choice left to him. Before the festival could begin, he took his own life, most accounts say by poison, others by opening his veins. He was no more than 20 years old. In that act, he reclaimed something no emperor had been able to take from him, the right to decide the terms of his end. It was the only moment in years where the choice was entirely his, and in choosing death, he denied Vitellius the spectacle he had so eagerly anticipated. Sporus's death passed quickly through the churning political news of 69 AD, overshadowed by battles, assassinations, and the constant turnover of emperors. To most chroniclers of the time, he was little more than an oddity, a lurid footnote in the annals of imperial decadence, a symbol of Nero's corruption rather than a person in his own right. But if you strip away the gossip, the courtly sneers, the theatrical cruelty, what remains is the story of a boy who spent almost half his life erased by the will of others. His body was reshaped without consent, his name replaced, his identity overwritten. He lived in a world where survival meant perfect obedience to a role written for someone else, a performance so complete it left no room for the person beneath. Ancient Rome preserved his memory only as Sabina, the bride of Nero. It did not record what Sporus dreamed of before the emperor noticed him. It did not care if he longed for freedom, if he feared the nights when his own reflection seemed like a stranger's face, if he ever found brief moments where he could simply be himself. That part of him was unimportant to the people who controlled his fate, perhaps the most telling cruelty of all. And yet, in his final act, he rejected the part they had written for him. Vitellius wanted to turn his life into a public spectacle of mockery and violence. Sporus chose instead to leave the stage entirely. In the brutal calculus of Roman power, this was defiance. The emperors had taken everything but his death, and so he gave that to himself. It's tempting to think of him only in terms of tragedy, but there is something enduring in the fact that 2,000 years later, his story still unsettles us. In the long shadow of Rome's marble monuments and imperial triumphs, we are reminded that history is not only the record of those who ruled, but also of those who were ruled over those who endured, resisted, or, in Sporus's case, refused to be broken entirely, even at the end. He will never be as famous as Nero, never stand in the center of a history book's page, but his life is a quiet warning about the reach of power into the most intimate parts of human existence, and his death, a refusal to be anyone's spectacle ever again.